Now, ever since the Christian interpretation of the book of Genesis, the theme of the righteous and mighty eagle versus the treacherous snake has been a prominent theme in Western civilization. And exampled from modern times, from World War II propaganda to children's toys, and in many other cultural aspects, this theme of the righteous versus the wicked is embedded into our cultural identity. However, I would say that the snake, not the eagle, it's the snake that has more to teach us at this particular point in history. In the case of this propaganda cartoon created by Benjamin Franklin, originally used to rally the colonies against the French, it was later used as a symbol of eternal vigilance by the American revolutionaries against the British Empire. To loyalists of the crown, however, this symbol certainly represented the deceit and treachery of the lowly American colonies. However, the true virtue or villainy of the snake is simply a matter of perspective. One man's hero is another man's villain, after all. Then, of course, there's the well-recognized Gadsden flag here, which depicts the timber rattlesnake. It's an animal that is indigenous to the eastern United States. By 1778, this flag and its many variations were adopted by the Continental Congress of the United States as the official seal of the War Office. It seemed a rather appropriate symbol given that the colonists' status as renegades, those terrible, evil people who broke away from the British Empire. Now, the U.S. military still uses some iteration of this flag in a few places. However, of course, as we know, it has long since become more fashionable, it always has been more fashionable, to use the almighty and powerful eagle instead. Oftentimes, it seems that the snake is curiously aligned with the enslaved, the disenfranchised, and it may be considered to be more wise. The snake is always considered to be cunning and wise, and perhaps even having truth and God on its side. The story of Moses and Aaron demanding the Pharaoh free his people in the Torah certainly represents a different attitude altogether when it comes to serpents. Aaron throws his staff on the ground at the Pharaoh's feet, which turns into a serpent. The Pharaoh, unimpressed, beckons two of his magicians to perform the same trick. Only, of course, the serpent of Aaron promptly consumes the other two snakes. This is a great quote by Joseph Campbell. Half the people in the world think that the metaphors of their religious traditions, for example, are facts, and the other half contend that they are not facts at all. As a result, we have people who consider themselves believers because they accept metaphors as facts, and we have others who classify themselves as atheists because they think religious metaphors are lies. In the Hebrew scriptures, there is something rather unique happening when it comes to references having to do with serpents. It seems that the serpent isn't really what it appears to be at all in the Hebrew Bible. After all, the scriptures were written during a time where there was no distinction between religion and magic, for the most part anyway. The worldview of the ancients were many magnitudes more symbolic and allegorical than in our literal, face value way of seeing the world today. When we think about what the ancients had to say through the writings they left behind, how should we interpret their words in the first place? As Campbell accurately points out, both the true believer and the atheist alike completely fail to account for the radically different worldview of the ancients, and how much this sort of failure can distort modern interpretations of biblical texts. If we can sometime, if sometime we can try and imagine what the daily life would have been like for ancient people at that time, then we can start to better understand where they were coming from in the first place. One of the best ways to accomplish this, to get yourself in their shoes and to think like they think and to view the world the way they viewed the world, is to try living like they did, even for a short time. And even without living like our ancient ancestors did, we can try and appreciate their perspective from the following example. Imagine yourself living in a simple structure like a yurt or a tent. There's no climate control, no electricity, no indoor plumbing, no heating, nothing. Just you in a tent. Your body is much more exposed to the elements. Instead of dwelling in places which are at a constant temperature, you must endure the extremes of the cold air at night and the heat of the sun on a summer day. In modern times, we no longer live by our senses because we are insulated from shifts in the weather by perfectly climate-controlled dwellings. And our senses, of course, are completely numbed out and distracted by electronic devices. Unlike the very soft and zoo-like lives that most of us live today, relying on one's senses, carefully observing the habits of animals, watching the movements of the planets and the stars, the subtle changes in weather, the changes in the seasons, all of this was very critical to human survival. As a result, no detail was too small, no event or sign from nature could afford to be ignored, right? And nor could one little symbol or sign from nature stand to completely be considered somehow separate from the whole picture, right? Because it could mean the difference between life and death if you weren't paying careful attention to the world around you and what everything means and what everything could possibly predict. The Hebrew scriptures were written at a time where human beings felt much more connected to their surroundings and subsequently could appreciate the symbolic and connected nature of all things. Without this sense, humanity would not have gotten far enough in its development to take this notion for granted in the first place like we do today. So in this context of the Hebrew scriptures, there is something rather unique happening when it comes to the references to serpents, which are referred to as tanin. It seems that this word, tanin, may bear some relation to the ancient Babylonian goddess known as Tiamat. Tiamat being the divine embodiment of primordial chaos. Of course, the divine feminine. In other words, tanin in the Hebrew scriptures seems to indicate the feminine or yin energy, which is associated with the raw, primordial essence of creation. Hence, Eve's association with the serpent in the book of Genesis and the feminine as the locus of earthly desire. And of course, there's nothing there's nothing worse in a Christian religion than earthly desire, right? So, of course, Eve and women are going to take the rap for humanity being cast out of the Garden of Eden, right? So the connection seems to go much deeper than most modern translations could when we're talking about Tanin and the nature of the serpent.